Okay, for the second talk, which will be a little bit shorter than the first one, I want us to think about not only how these things played themselves out in the founding, that is, these ideas, but again, that inheritance and where they're coming from, where these ideas are coming from. And I want to turn to a moment, I think a great moment in history, though it's rarely talked about, pretty much been forgotten in our textbooks. It's a speech that was given by then Representative John Quincy Adams, a speech he gave in 1839. He gave it on April 29th of 1839. He had been in the presidency, he had left the presidency, he had been probably our best Secretary of State ever. Up to this point, was one of our worst presidents ever. And then he went back into the House, which I think is a great thing. It's a nice comment on his civic virtue. I didn't ask to have a huge library dedicated to him, or, and God bless Ike Eisenhower, but if any of you have ever been to Abilene, it looks like a bad Star Trek set with all the kind of crazy music, and we make these huge monuments to these presidents. And in the 19th century, it was a little bit different. That's what you do for your country. And so he went back and he served, and he actually turned out to be one of the best representatives of his time. He was quite cantankerous. He was very interesting, always a great orator. And so he was asked in 1839 to give a speech to commemorate the 50th anniversary of George Washington having taken the first oath of office. Now, this speech, I'm not going to read it all to you. If you look it up, and it's not reprinted in many places, but you can find it on the web. It ends up being 72 pages in small print PDF format. Now, I don't know if he kept his audience there that night for hours on end as he was delivering this, and I'm not going to read all of that. I'm only going to read the beginning. But I do want to put him into context for a moment. As I said, he was a great Secretary of State. He may have been our best. He's a terrible president. I won't say he was our worst, but he certainly would be in the bottom percent in terms of presidencies. And then he ended up being very good in the House of Representatives. But I pity him in many ways, as I do many of the men and women of his generation, because I doubt if there's ever been a generation in American history that had a more difficult task. Think about someone like John Quincy Adams, who knew George Washington, who knew Thomas Jefferson, who knew his father very well, who knew Patrick Henry, who knew all of these men who had done something that really had not been done since the fall of Rome. They created a stable, thriving, expanding republic. How can they live up to that? In what way can that second generation, whether we're talking about a John Quincy Adams or an Andrew Jackson or a John C. Calhoun, a Henry Clay, a Daniel Webster, how could any of these men ever live up? It's for one thing for us to look back, and we can either take Washington for what he was, or we can mythologize him, we can dismiss him, but we don't know him. We know about him, but we didn't know him. But just think about someone like John Quincy Adams, who not only traveled throughout the world with his father, picked up languages, but saw, here's his father growing up in these diplomatic courts in Europe, in Asia, trying to get recognition of this republic. People don't even know what a republic is. You don't have a king. You don't have any of this. People laughing at his father, at John Adams over and over again, not only for his disposition, but for the fact he pretended to be a liaison from a republic. And this son saw that his father had to be away from his mother, whom he loved dearly, for years on end at a time. This was not an easy life. This was serious sacrifice. And I think about someone like John Quincy Adams, who at age 8 stood with his father in the second floor of their apartment building and watched across the street the Battle of Bunker's Hill. There's an 8-year-old who witnesses that. Now, what can you do as an adult to live up to that? It's probably impossible. And that second generation of Americans, they had to struggle with this. This is really difficult. Some came out here. People who led the revolt against Santa Anna, they could do something out here in Texas, and they did it quite successfully. But you can't do that everywhere. And it wouldn't be good if you did it everywhere. It's good where you do it in some places. But you can't overthrow everybody all the time, and you can't just wait for the dictator to come up. You've got to take your opportunities, but that's very hard. So there is a legacy, of course. Standing here in Houston, there's a legacy of that, but it's not easy. And we know what a mess the War of 1812 was. And all we have to do is go back and look at the documents from 1811 and 1812. They're stating quite clearly, we need to go to war because we have to prove to our fathers that we're worthy of what they gave us. That's a difficult thing. So let me jump to 1839. Here's John Quincy Adams thinking about what this moment of the presidency, the taking the oath of office, meant. And we can say all kinds of things. I could be very cynical here and say, can you imagine any politician speaking like this or even thinking like this? It doesn't exist anymore. This is a lost world. In many ways, it was a better world. In other ways, it was a terrible world. But it was a different world no matter what. Would it be an unlicensed trespass of the imagination to conceive that on the night preceding the day of which you now commemorate the 50th anniversary, on the night preceding the 30th of April, 1789, when from the balcony of your city hall, the Chancellor of the State of New York administered to George Washington the solemn oath faithfully to execute the office of the President of the United States? Just imagine for a moment. This had never been done before. Never. What was the president? The president was the person who ran the local garden society. They didn't call him the great potentate and protector of human dignity and natural rights. They gave him the title of a club. This had never been done before, and that was intentional. He's a president. He can preside over this. And so here he is taking this oath of office, never been done before. The solemn oath faithfully to execute the office of the President of the United States and to the best of his ability to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. That in the visions of the night, the guardian angel of the father of our country appeared before him, and in the venerated form of his mother, to cheer and encourage him in the performance of the momentous and solemn duties that he was about to assume, delivered to him a suit of celestial armor, a helmet consisting of the principles of piety, of justice, of honor, of benevolence, with which from his earliest infancy he had hitherto walked through life in the presence of all of his brethren. That's that universal again, all of his brethren. A spear studded with the self-evident truths of the Declaration of Independence, a sword, the same with which he had led the armies of his country through the War of Freedom to the summit of independence, a corselet of long experience and habitual intercourse in peace and war with the world of mankind, his contemporaries of the human race in all their stages of civilization, and last of all, the Constitution of the United States, a shield embossed by heavenly hands with the future history of its country written upon it. Can you imagine any politician giving a speech like that today? Can you imagine any politician not only thinking like that, but having the ability to write like that and to be able to draw upon all the literary references and assume that his audience knew them as well? Now, let me give you just three, and there are more than that in here, but let me give you three references. What is the Declaration of Independence? It is written, carved on the spear that George Washington carried. This is a reference to Norse mythology. Odin, the king of the Norse gods, carried with him a staff that had been carved from the original tree of creation of life. And on that staff was written the natural law. This is one of the reasons, it's one of many reasons, but it was one of the reasons that Odin was so wise. Anytime there was a conflict, he could read his staff. He had the natural law written right there. So here we bring in the Norse. It's always good to bring in the Norse. And so here we have the Norse. But what else do we see? Yeah, wonderful, ancient, classical reference. In particular, a reference that probably many of us in this room are familiar with. Think about St. Paul in his letters to the people of Ephesus. Finally, brethren, be strengthened in the Lord and in the might of his power. Put you on the armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the deceits of the devil. For our wrestling is not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers, against the rulers of the world of this darkness, against the spirits of wickedness in the high places. Therefore, take unto you the armor of God, that you may be able to resist in the evil day and to stand in all things perfect. Stand therefore, having your loins girt about with truth, having on the breastplate of justice, and your feet shod with the preparation of the gospel of peace, and in all things the shield of faith, wherewith you may be able to extinguish all the fiery darts of the most wicked one, and take unto you the helmet of salvation, the sword of the Spirit. Now that's pretty blatant. Here we have, in the venerated form of his mother, the guardian angel appearing to George Washington, to a president, not to a king. We might expect that to a king. We might expect that to a leader of the Orient. We might expect that to a Darius or Xerxes. But we don't really expect that when we think of George Washington. And yet there's another reference to this as well, one of my favorites, and it's this almost perfect blending of everything that had come before the American experience, all culminating in this moment. And of course, Adams does not intend for his audience to take this literally. This is meant to be mythologizing. He is taking the founding and he is mythologizing it. But notice what he's put in. We've got Odin, the god of wisdom, the Norse god. We have Paul, that great, great Jew who converts, a man who spoke Greek, a man who was a Roman citizen and could walk relatively safely on Roman roads. Remember when he's thrown in prison, all he has to do is tell the guard, I'm a Roman citizen. The guard has to think about that. Oh, I can't jail a Roman citizen. Lets him go. That's how powerful it was to be a Roman citizen. Think about Paul when he's in Athens. He doesn't walk into Athens and say, you scum, you scoundrels who know nothing. He says, you have this statue to an unknown God. And that's the greatest truth you have here, that you recognized there's something beyond yourselves. And if you remember what Paul says when he's there, beautiful, he says, in him we move and live and have our being, which is now scriptural. It's Acts 17. But the original line is 300 years older than when Paul gave it, almost 400 years older. The original line was, in Zeus we move and live and have our being. This was not a man who dismissed the culture that he encountered. He understood what he was encountering. John Quincy Adams is doing the same thing, but he's bringing another reference in here. It's not just the descent upon Paul, or Paul talking about the descent and the army. He is also referencing what I consider to be, probably outside of Scripture, the greatest story ever told. And this is Virgil's Aeneid, which is a brilliant story. And no matter how much we might raise our eyes or scoff at the classics, this is a page-turner. This isn't one of those staid, boring books. I kind of find Jane Austen that way sometimes, sorry. I mean, this is yeah, I shouldn't have said that, should I? But Virgil, let me talk about the good things. Virgil is amazing. This story has everything you can want. It has tragedy, it has success, it has a Carthaginian witch who commits suicide. Aeneas has to descend into hell. This is good stuff. It is really good, and it truly is a page-turner. And the story is the story of truth. It's about many things, but at its heart, the story of the Aeneid is about the story of truth. The Trojans carry with them a certain manly virtue and truth. They are deceived by the Greeks, who create this huge lawn ornament and are then brought into the city in Troy. They descend out of this thing in the middle of the night. They go after the women and children, of course, because they're not real men. And they destroy the Trojan culture, almost. And Aeneas, this great leader, thinks all is lost. And what does he do? He takes his men and he starts on this epic journey throughout the Mediterranean and again into hell and back. And ultimately he lands on the Tiber. And he encounters a savage people there, the Latins. And after warring with them, he realizes that they have to intermingle. They have to form one people. And there are promises all along the way. Jupiter, the king of the gods, has promised safe passage for Aeneas. But when his wife Juno gets involved, then he backs down. He may be the king of the gods, but not at home. And then his daughter, Venus, comes and says, no, you promised me. And Jupiter steps back and he says, I'm going to stay neutral on this. The women can fight about it. And that's it. Aeneas, who had been promised by the king of the gods safe passage, is betrayed. And Venus, as it turns out, happens to be the mother of Aeneas, and that's never a bad thing if your mother's a goddess. And she then goes to her husband, Jupiter, has him create, to Vulcan, has him create weapons. And this is a great passage from the Aeneid. Now think about what John Quincy Adams had just said. But the goddess Venus, lustrous among the cloud banks, bearing her gifts, approached, and when she spotted her son alone, right, Aeneas alone, she hailed him, suddenly there before him. Look, just forged to the perfection by my husband's skill the gifts I promised. There's no need now, my son, to flinch from fighting swaggering Latin ranks or challenging the savages to a duel. And with that, Venus reached to embrace her son and set the brilliant armor down before him under an oak. Aeneas takes delight. I love the shift in tenses here. Aeneas takes delight in the goddess's gifts and the honor of it all as he runs his eyes across them piece by piece, and he cannot get enough of them, filled with wonder, turning them over, now with his hands, now with his arms, the terrible crested helmet, plumed and shooting fire, the sword blade honed to kill, the breastplate, solid bronze, blood red and immense, like a dark blue cloud inflamed by the sun's rays and gleaming through the heavens, and then the burnished greaves of electrum, smelted gold, the spear and the shield, the workmanship of that shield, no words could ever tell. For there upon the shield was written the story of Italy, the story of Rome in all of her triumphs. There Vulcan had forged them, well aware of the seers and schooled in the times to come, and in all the order of the generations of the future, and every war they would wage, city upon city. Now, it's incredible writing, for one thing, or incredible translating, as the case may, not mine, Fagel's here, but just brilliant. But think about that imagery. Betrayed by the king of the gods, Venus the goddess, and it has to be Venus. This is the goddess of love. It has to be Venus. Venus descends, and she arms her son with these incredible weapons. The same thing, basically, that Paul says in his letter to the Ephesians, and of course, what John Quincy Adams is saying is being given to George Washington. Now, again, think about what kind of audience it would take to understand all of this, to get that what John Quincy Adams is doing is intermingling with perfection the Christian and pagan inheritances of the West. He is tying these things together in a moment of brilliance and a recognition that the Western tradition is not an either or, it's a both and. Christianity did not overturn all that came before it, but it baptized and sanctified the best of what had been found. And we can continue that line. There is a line, there is a narrative to be found, so that when we get to the American founding, it is in line with the best of this tradition, because it does, at a very fundamental level, recognize the dignity and the uniqueness of the individual human person. And so we can speak without hypocrisy, no matter what the faults, what the flaws, we can speak and say, yeah, the founders actually believed in this. Not only did they believe in it, but they thought that it might even be possible to create a system or purify an existing one that allowed for the protection of human rights, that allowed for the protection, the uniqueness, the weirdness, the eccentricities of the human person. And it's not without accident that long before John Quincy Adams gave this speech, George Washington, of all men, George Washington was known as the American Aeneas. Just as this truth in the Aeneid had been replanted on the Tiber and then again on the Thames, it can be replanted on the Potomac or on the Hudson. It's truth. It can be forgotten, it can be mocked, but it can't be destroyed. It only has to be remembered. One of my favorite scholars, a man by the name of Eric Vogelin, who taught at Louisiana State for much of his career, talked about the American founding using Platonic terms. He talked about it as the great anamnesis to remember. What is the American founding? It is a moment of remembrance. Is it perfect? No. We look through all things as in a glass darkly. Do we see all things? No, we're limited. Do we understand all things? Of course not. But this is why we rely on ancient sources of wisdom. This is why we rely on experience. This is why we rely on one another in relationship. So it's no accident that George Washington had this label. People knew what the Aeneid was. They knew the story. They understood its significance. They realized it could also lead to empire. We don't generally think of Rome without also thinking of the Republic descending into the empire. And that was not a lesson that was lost upon the American founders. So I want to think just a little bit more about this. And let me give you, and I take this from Gleaves Whitney, who's also very much affiliated with the Center for the American Republic. But just imagine one of our greatest symbols, our Capitol building. What does it look like? It doesn't look like the Taj Mahal. It doesn't come out of Timbuktu. It doesn't look like an Egyptian or a Mayan pyramid. It doesn't even look like what you might expect, Parliament. That would actually make sense. What does it look like? It is a Roman building put in the middle of a swamp. That's what it is. And it is a grand Roman building. And there are Republican, small r Republican Roman symbols everywhere on the Capitol. Everywhere. You can't walk around D.C. and look at the architecture of the 19th century without seeing Roman symbolism everywhere. It's everywhere. If you walk down in Baltimore, if you walk down to the main column, the World War I monument in the middle of Baltimore, it is a Roman classical column taken from the late Republican period. And all around it is the symbol that we find in Congress. And what's that symbol? It's a symbol of a bundle of sticks bound together surrounding an axe. It's the fasces, the oldest of Republican symbols, the community coming together, the res publica, the republic coming together for self-defense. You can't war if the axe is in the middle of the people. It's only for self-defense. And yet, it mattered. And so Washington is seen as this great, almost Roman demigod brought back to life in his own lifetime. He was the single best-known figure in the Western world at the time of his death in 1799. He was better known than any other figure in the West at that time. And he was seen as this great man. And he was a great man. There's no question about that. We can do all we want to make up stories about cherry trees and whether he chopped them down or not. But in the end, all we have to do is look at Washington the man. He was an incredible figure. This is a man who not only led his people to independence through every kind of difficulty, but when he was offered the dictatorship on the Ides of March of 1783, he turned it down. And he gave an incredible speech about the meaning of liberty and how he would never sully the dignity of what they had earned. How many men in history can say they have turned down that kind of power? That is very rare. And that in and of itself argues for some uniqueness in the American founding. But again, why is it, going back to Gleaves's point, that is, here we have this great symbol of the Republic right in the middle, the great symbol of Rome right in the middle of our capital. Even the word itself, right? Of course, a Roman Latin word. I turn to another figure, a great figure, one who's still with us, now approaching very much the end of his career, a man by the name of Forrest McDonald, who has done great work on what he calls the intellectual world of the American founding. And he notes something very important, that of the founding generation, so we'll lump them all together, the men and women who served basically between 1763 and 1794, we'll use those dates, that if we just look at the men who served in government, the men who wrote the Articles of Confederation, the Declaration, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the Northwest Ordinance, that it is the exception, it is the norm rather than the exception that these people were educated, and I mean formally educated. The vast majority of the American founders were formally educated. Now, of course, in the history of the world, education is rare. It waxes and wanes. But I have to say this as well, and this always rubs modern audiences wrong, and maybe it should. But education meant a very specific thing prior to the 20th century. All education was synonymous with liberal education. To be an engineer was a great, noble thing. To be an architect was a great, noble thing. To be a lawyer could be a great, noble thing. But studying those things did not make one educated. It made one trained. To be educated meant that you understood Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, Livy, all of these figures. It meant that you had read the Aeneid. It meant that you knew Greek and Latin. And Forrest MacDonald shows, and of course there's no public education in the 18th century, but in New England, where they did have a form of common school, and people were mandated, if possible, it was never fully carried out. But remember, we're also talking about extremely already well-educated Calvinist Protestants. Well, I don't have to, Protestant Calvinists, that's probably better. They're very well-educated. As Christopher Dawson said, you cannot find Calvinists anywhere without them taking with them Scripture, Calvin's Institutes, and the classics, everywhere they go. And so in New England, it shouldn't surprise us, of all places in North America, that we actually have the beginnings of what we would call later public education. But public education, what was called a common school, it didn't matter if you were a farm kid or if your dad was a lawyer. All common education meant 8 to 10 hours of being drilled in Greek and Latin starting at the age of 6. This is what education was. Nobody went to school in the 1800s to learn a skill. They learned Greek and Latin, even if they only went for 1 or 2 years. So all education at that time was liberal education. Liberal, of course, in the best sense of the word. It had nothing to do with politics. It's a complete corruption in the modern world of that word. Liberal in its ultimate proper sense meant to be liberated from the things of this world. That's what a liberal person was. A liberal person, someone who was educated, was not bound to this moment. He lived in this moment, but he understood that there was something far greater. He was liberal. He was liberated from it. So, from those of you coming from a Christian background, when Paul writes in 1 Corinthians that there is a wisdom of this world and there's a wisdom of the next, those who advocated liberal education argued these are timeless truths. This is God's wisdom. Again, understood poorly by us, but these are things that transcend. As Cicero would say, it doesn't matter if we're in Athens or in Rome. It doesn't matter if it's yesterday, today, or tomorrow. These things are true. And so liberal education had this glorious, really heritage to it, and it wasn't until the 1870s, 80s, and 90s that it was really torn apart. But that's another story. But it was so effectively torn apart that we tend to think of liberal education as this eccentric thing. But in the norm of the world, it certainly was not eccentric. So Forrest MacDonald does this great thing. He says, all right, well, let's just look at what a college was like in America in the 18th century. And he takes a random date. He's somewhere in the 1750s, 1760s. And there are only a few colleges. We've got Princeton, College of New Jersey, William and Mary, Yale, Harvard. There aren't that many. And he picks King's College, which is now Columbia. King's College, and they all have essentially the same way of thinking about this. And so he looks at the entrance requirements. Now, the average student entered college in the 18th century at the age of 14. So you went to college between about 14 and 17 to get your BA. So now think about that for a moment. Now, how do you get in? And this, he's just quoting. He's quoting from the entrance requirements. To be entered into King's College, a student must be able to translate the first 3 of Cicero's select orations, as well as the first 3 of Virgil's Aeneid, and to translate the first 10 chapters of the Gospel of John from Greek into Latin. As well, now notice it's not even Latin to English or English to Latin, but Greek to Latin. You're 14. You have to be able to do this, as well as be an expert in arithmetic and have a blameless moral character. Now, I always joke with my students, if you're fluent in Greek and Latin at 14, probably not much chance you don't have a blameless moral character. You haven't been doing much else. But imagine, to be fluent, you had to have started at about the age of 6. And this is what you do. This is education. Now, step back for a moment. Should we be surprised that when they give titles to one another, that they call the elite building of our Congress, which is actually an Anglo-Saxon word, but an elite building, they call it the Senate? Goes back to a very old Republican tradition. Or when they write, they sign the name Publius in the Federalist Papers. Or, and I was doing these calculations today, see if I can find them right now. I have them, yeah. not going to be able to find them at the moment, but I was looking through a new index. It's pretty fun, actually. This is what I do for fun. I was looking through a new index to the Federalist Papers, trying to figure out, and I've got this pretty much, I think I can remember it, just looking at what they were referencing in these 80-some papers as the great handbook of debate in favor of the Constitution. Not one reference to John Locke. Not one. Never in the debates. 4 references to the great figure of the day, Montesquieu. Only 4. 75 references to the classical world. It's everywhere. Every little city-state you've never heard of, the founders knew about. It's astounding to go back and see how deeply they were in their understanding, how deep they went in their understanding of the founding, of the classics. They lived and they breathed this. This was a part of their life. Now let me jump back just a little bit further from this. In America at the time of the American Revolution, again, I'm taking this all from Forrest McDonald. Forrest McDonald notes that there were only 5,000 separate book titles in all 13 colonies. Now, there will be multiple copies of each of those books, but 5,000 titles total. And this is in an area where you have abundant trees to make paper. Right? You can pulp them everywhere. There are printing presses, more printing presses in America than any other place in the world at this time. And yet there are only 5,000 titles. And of course, what are the titles? They're all the classics. The classics, this is what people read. Not that Farmer Joe comes off the Massachusetts farm and spends his evening reading Cicero or Livy. He probably doesn't. But he would have access to it, not in public libraries because they didn't exist, but in private libraries. And one of my favorite stories that goes behind this is the Calvinist minister at all places, Lexington, Massachusetts, who had been the minister, only the 3rd minister in this town, starting his ministry in the 1750s. And of course, he was the leader of the town. He had a private library. And if any of you have been to Lexington, and I highly recommend it, my time there with my kids was one of the most moving experiences of my life. It was incredible. Actually seeing where this thing started, seeing where the entire revolution started, right here. And it's built on this green. This is Lexington along the green. This is the famous green. And it's not a square. It's actually this kind of weird trapezoidal thing. And one road goes south to Concord, and another goes up to New Hampshire, and the green is right in the middle. The church, the meeting house, is in the middle of the green. Across the street from that is the city pub, and next to the city pub is the minister's house. And the minister had one of the 10 great libraries in North America, a man by the name of Jonas Clark. This is the guy who had been the minister of this town since the 1750s. And anybody could come and borrow one of his books. And they did. People came from all over to get his books, and he had only one requirement. When you're done, you come back and you give me a review of that book, and we'll talk about it. Now, that's pretty great. This is how America worked. And these ideas were spread, not just through these small libraries, but they were spread through men like Jonas Clark, who, if you go back and read his sermons of the 1760s, he is quoting Scripture as much as he's quoting the classics, because there's no divide. In their mind, this is a continuation. These are two streams flowing into the same river. Christianity, of course, is far beyond anything the pagans gave us. But it's not an either-or. It is a both-and. And so we find these references constantly. A reference to Cicero next to a reference to any of the Old Testament prophets, especially Micah, but all over in the 1760s. This was our heritage. It was the Judeo-Christian, Greco-Roman heritage, and it transcended any moment. Let me read one other thing from Forrest McDonald, because I love this, and it tells you a lot about these people. There was a dispute. Well, I'll read this directly. In 1786, Isaiah Thomas, printer of a weekly newspaper in Worcester, Massachusetts, called the Massachusetts Spy, was seeking new ways to amuse his readers because there wasn't much news. There had been some controversy over Alexander Pope's new translation of the Iliad. Samuel Johnson is said to have quipped, "Well, sir, this is beautiful, but is it Homer?" And so Thomas gave his readers the opportunity to decide for themselves if it was a good translation. And he dedicated several issues of the Massachusetts Spy to reprinting the Iliad, Greek on one page and English, the translation, on the other. How many of us in this room could go through and do this? This is a wonderfully different world. And yet this is what people understood. It's what they expected. This is what a literate audience could do. Well, let me end with this because, and then we'll have a few minutes for questions. We need to go back to this question of liberty, the question of national rights. What's it have to do with all this? Talking about the Aeneid, talking about the Ephesians, St. Paul, and so forth. How does this come together? And I want to make a point that I think is very important, and it's going to be, maybe not in this room, but it would be, for example, if I were speaking with my colleagues in political science, this would be extremely controversial to them. It's interesting to me to go back to the founding and look at how often, especially George Washington, talked about my country. You see it everywhere. And I want to develop this at some point in an article or something, but right now it's just kind of floating around in the ether of Brad's brain, which is really scary. And it's everywhere. People always talk about my citizenship to my country, and it's always capital C. Now, there were a lot of capitalizations at the time, so it's possible that people were just capitalizing. But you see this over and over again, and Washington especially. Washington will distinguish. He will say, and as I speak to my Americans, we must now think about what it means to be a citizen of the country. And it's not, grammatically, it's not quite the same thing. It's not quite synonymous. And I've been very interested in this, because if you go back to another great work, a work that actually Winston introduced me in a conference we did maybe 5 years ago, that one at that kind of spooky hotel downtown, which was really nice, but it was a little too avant-garde. We read one of the great books called On the Laws, written by Cicero. You were there, Herman. It was a Hotel Zaza. Zaza. Yeah. It's a pretty funky place. But anyway, then we had this incredible discussion. And Cicero in this book is written a year perhaps before he was murdered by Mark Antony. So we're talking roughly 44 BC. It's the last of the great Roman Republicans. He makes this statement, and remember earlier I quoted him, paraphrased him by saying, whatever law there is in Athens has to be the same as there is in Rome, and it has to be the same in the past, the present, and the future, because we're men, and the nature of man does not change. And the God, and he always talked about the God, and actually he identified the God with logos, the God must have this in mind. This is what he must mean. Well, Cicero in On the Laws says that all men and women of reason, and by reason, those who are willing to communicate with one another, not throw sound bites at one another, not beat each other over the head with some ideological quip, but actually discuss in serious conversation the things that matter most, that they are citizens of what he called the cosmopolis, the city of eternity. And of course, for those of you who know the Christian tradition, St. Augustine takes this quite clearly, and it becomes the city of God as opposed to the city of man. Clearly the cosmopolis, and we could never read Augustine without first knowing Cicero as well as Aristotle and Plato, and Scripture, of course. But it's all kind of right there. And so we have this in the ancient world. The country, the cosmopolis, is something that transcends it. Washington's favorite play was his favorite thing, and in fact he almost got a classical education just by memorizing this play, was a play that was written in the 17 teens by a great English author, Joseph Addison. And the play is called Cato, a Tragedy. And it's about the last days of the last Roman senator to resist Caesar, Marcus Cato, Cato the Younger. And Cato the Younger is defeated, and it's a horrible, tragic story. Now, this was Washington's favorite. In fact, during the winter at Valley Forge, rumor is, and no one's verified this, but rumor is he had this performed 7 times. Oh, yeah, we have copies of it here. And it's also, again, Liberty Fund has this exact same edition in PDF form online. The story then follows Cato. And Cato's a Stoic, right? bound by this old philosophy that's about 300 years older than Christ. The Stoics worship the Logos as God, but they're still pagan pantheists. You got close, but still pagan pantheists. And Cato decides the only way out, because he must remain virtuous, is to commit suicide. Now that's a problem, especially for a Christian audience in the 18th century. It's a major problem. And Addison drags it out. He doesn't die right away. He has time to contemplate. In fact, he has Plato's treatise on the soul, and we get a whole discourse whether or not Plato is correct and is there eternity and so forth. And of course, it's really a very Christian discussion, though couched in Platonic language. But here's the point, and I am coming to the point. Cato is trying to wonder if republican virtue and the spirit of the country can remain, especially once he's gone, because he doesn't know what's left in Rome. The only person who seems to be left is Cicero, and of course Cicero will be murdered by Mark Antony very quickly. He doesn't know that, but he knows that's about it. So who's left? Who's going to withstand Caesar? How will the republic be prevented from falling? It probably won't. He knows that. But of course that means that his duty then is somehow to create a legacy in which this true thing, the republic, can be remembered in the future. So it's not accidental then that George Washington loves this play. And in fact, when he refuses to take the dictatorship on the Ides of March 15th of 1783, he quotes liberally from this. In lines I'm sure you're familiar with: "I regret that I have but one life to give for my country. Give me liberty or give me death." These are all straight out of Cato. Everybody read Cato in the 18th century. It was a very, very famous play. But let me end with this one dialogue. As Cato is dying, now think about this, this is 18th century. As Cato is dying and he's wondering if his legacy will continue, he is standing with his one ally, who happens to be an Ethiopian. He's standing with his ally. Now think about that for a moment. This is the 18th century, and he is talking to a black African. Now, of course, in the Western tradition, that wouldn't be that weird. St. Augustine was from roughly the same region. It's there. But we're talking about 18th century America. This man's name is Juba. And so Juba is lamenting that he's not a Roman. This is the dialogue. Juba says, and remember, Cato's dying. Juba says, "I blush and I am confounded to appear in thy presence, Cato." Cato responds, "Well, what is thy crime?" Juba, "I'm an African." Cato says, "Ah, but a brave one, thou hast a Roman soul." Juba responds, "Ah, but hast thou not heard of all of thy false countrymen?" And Cato responds, "Alas, young prince, falsehood and fraud shoot up in every soil, in the product of every climate. Rome has its Caesars. You are a Roman." Now just think about that. You can be male, female, Greek, Jew, bond, slave, or free. It doesn't matter. This is something that transcends who and what we are in the particulars. And so my own belief, and again, this is probably a stretch, but when we look at the language used by the founders, and they are constantly talking not only about this stuff, and Rome, and Greece, and the Corinthians, and the Ephesians, when they're looking at all of this and tying it together, when they speak about America, they're not necessarily speaking about America right and wrong, bash everybody in until they agree with this. It's much more of, we have discovered certain truths that we did not create, but we know to be true across time, as true in the past as they are now, as they will be in the future. And with that truth, as George Washington said in his first address to Congress, there can be in the economy and course of nature no ever any dissolution between virtue and happiness. My countrymen, we must belong to this, right, our country. And so I do think, and we can be as patriotic as we want, but I do think when it comes down to it, the founding was a brilliant moment in time. But it was brilliant not because it was original, but because it was an original understanding of timeless truths. And I think Washington and these other men understood this, just as Cato knew that Juba did not have to have the same skin color or be of the same country to be a man. He was a man by his virtue. All right, thank you.